when you're walking around a town or a city, everything looks normal. People are doing whatever they want, and surprisingly, when you see a person's appearance, we get to read what's on the outside, but in reality, they're probably hiding something on the inside. The world is suffering from the terror of human trafficking. Human trafficking has been haunting everyone across the globe to the point where it's been called the modern day slavery. Human trafficking isn't something new. It's been happening for centuries. According to the Gale Opposing Viewpoints Online Connection on the document called Human Trafficking, they define human trafficking as the recruitment, the transportation, and the housing of another person for sexual exploits. Traffickers usually deceive or force their victims to lure them in. Tactics that include kidnapping, drugging, and even using online ads to lure in these victims. Sometimes people are fooled by the promises that traffickers make as well. There's different types of human trafficking. There's sex trafficking, there's forced labor, forced marriages, illegal child custody, children soldiers, and the market of selling organs. Traffickers use all of this just to make profit off the victims. Victims are also hard to track because they're moving to international borders, or they're just moving country to country. According to the NASDAQ in New York, human traffickers generate around $150 billion just off of sexual exploit across the globe. That just shows you that traffickers do not even give a dime about human beings and their lives. Now, Jordan Greenball, he made an article about the sex trafficking in the United States. In his article, the United Nations, they did a global study that 106 countries were able to identify people who have been trafficked. According to Megan Ladd, who made an article called Texas Human Trafficking, approximately 40 million victims of trafficking in 2016, and that 29 million were women and girls, which makes up 72% of the victims. Also, Martini Tanner, she also made an article which is called "How Trauma Relates to the Sex Trafficking of Challenging Parenting: The Insights from a Mexican and Central America Survivors in the U.S." Castor Tanner was able to pick up a statistic that says that the U.S. is one of the 4 top countries alone in commercial sex marketing. And also, when it comes to international victims, that the U.S. victims, most of the victims from the U.S. come from Central America or Mexico. The earliest stage of human trafficking was during the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted about 350 years ago. It was approximately estimated that around 9.9 million Africans and later on their descendants were subjugated to slavery for life. They were kidnapped, they were beaten, they were raped, and the worst part of all, they were separated from their families for centuries. Even though the many laws and factors came into play into solving the transatlantic slave trade, human trafficking still found its way to sneak into the underground business. Throughout the world, migrants were a big prey for human traffickers. Migrants, they usually leave their country from war-torn countries. They're either looking for a better paying job that's able to pay the bills and put food on the table. When they're looking for these jobs, they often get forced into forced labor from human traffickers because they become tricked. According to a free labor approach, by Human Trafficking by James Gray Pope. The fears of deportation and cultural isolation makes undocumented migrants more vulnerable and making them more likely candidates for underground labor market, which is shown on page 27, because these are pretty much immigrants. They're going to different countries. They're just looking for a better life. So obviously they're not gonna know who to trust or who to ask for the right source of information, which causes them to end up probably meeting with a trafficker, promising them, oh, this is good pay, this is good pay, this is good that, give me your information, or just come along with me and we'll show you, and boom, right there, they're literally caught in an underground, probably in an underground forced labor. Migrants, when they're usually in forced labor, they're usually barely fed, and they're barely getting enough nutrients from drinking, and they work grueling hours, which causes they become sleep deprived. They probably get insomnia. They probably get all these types of stuff, and then they're still being forced to work. They're being threatened, and also they're being threatened. Now, sex trafficking is pretty much being pretty much forced sexual exploitation. Megan lied once again. She did or she cited another study which almost 5 million victims. There's 5 million people that across the globe that were victims of sex trafficking, and that children were making up 20% of that number, which is insane. Most of the time, there's many types of commercialized sex work on the sex trafficking of women and girls by Nesha Desh Pandey, and also Nerwa Noor. Things like pornography, things like sex, exotic dancers, live sex shows, and many other things fall under the umbrella in sex trafficking, because sex trafficking is one of the biggest type of human trafficking that is across the globe, and it probably makes the most money. Just like migrants, victims of sex trafficking are being tricked into promising to good jobs, possibly citizenship in a country, or even a good education. Sadly, a lot of these victims were sold off from their probably family members, and mainly traffickers. When it comes to sex trafficking, they target young girls to put them into the sex trade. They go to families that are pretty much vulnerable to poverty, drug addiction. They even go to dysfunctional families that are not working out well, which gives them more leeway just to sell off their kids just to get money to put food for themselves. Now, traffickers, they play the psychological games on these women just to keep them from escaping. Mainly, traffickers, they'll mess around with them, telling them if you do this and that. They pretty much blackmail them. That's what they do. Or most of the time, they just buy them clothes, jewelry, or even money just to keep these girls in line. Human traffickers eventually leave psychological trauma during and after captivity. For example, the daily abuse of mental and physical pain on a sex worker can traumatize them for years, to the point that they won't be able to recover, and they won't be able to move on with society. On page 16, on the visible chains on psychological choreograph of human trafficking by Elizabeth Harper, explains the psychological trauma that victims face when they lose their individual freedom. Harper also says that the framework of reference for understanding the world is also altered, which is also shown on page 16. A victim's experience from human trafficking causes them to lose trust in others, which also, to the point, they lose trust in themselves, and they also lose themselves as a whole, as an individual. Victims are also diagnosed with things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, and many more things, and catching sexual transmitted diseases like AIDS, HIV, gonorrhea, all those stuff. Just that trauma alone just breaks down these victims emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. Now, after terrorizing the globe for centuries, the world how does the world really respond to prevent human trafficking? Well, a couple alternatives and methods for the government has been thought out throughout the years. Um, on David Hodges' sexual trafficking on the United States, a domestic problem with transitional dimensions. He explains how the U.S. passed the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000, which Hodges explains that the act recognizes how previous laws have failed to protect victims of human trafficking because mainly the victims were punished more than the traffickers, and also that it helps the victims from trafficking from getting penalized unlawfully from trafficking. For example, a victim can be moving to state with no documents, and probably no documents, which causes them to get arrested because it's illegal. It's pretty much immigration. So, like for example, like ICE can pick up a trafficker because of that. So, through that, the act also provided special visas to protect victims from traffickers, which makes it harder for traffickers to track their money, their profit. Also, another thing that Hodges brings up is that not only the U.S. but many other countries has been thinking about legalizing prostitution, which is causing a huge controversy. Hodges explains how officials argue that the sex industry should be something that shouldn't be hiding in the shadows, but instead should be brought into the light into government regulation. So pretty much it will help eliminate child prostitution, and it will give women more safer protocols from violence and pretty much from trafficking in general. I guess that's what sexual prostitution would do. But the problem is legalizing prostitution can also make it harder for traffickers to be more transparent to officials, or to like government officials, for example, like the FBI, the CIA, for any other country. Because now, if you're gonna legalize prostitution, that just makes it easier for traffickers to make their money. They could probably say that this is a business that they're doing, and in reality, they're probably stealing these people and probably forging their contracts and stuff. And that's how boom, that's their prostitution industry right there. So, with that being said, human trafficking is obviously one of the biggest things happening. Many countries are involved with it. Me being Haitian myself, there's a lot of human trafficking going on in Haiti, and human trafficking is just. I feel like human trafficking is more of a thing that needs to be addressed and needs to be taken more seriously before it blows out proportion.